Tantor Audio presents The Bill of Rights, The Fight to Secure America's Liberties, by Berkin, narrated by Pam Ward. Prologue. For the majority of modern Americans, the Bill of Rights stands as the most important element of the Constitution, the touchstone, as James Madison hoped it would become, of our shared unalienable rights and liberties. Along with the Declaration of Independence, these first 10 amendments, with their guarantees of freedom of speech, religion, and the press, and the right to assemble, their promise of a speedy trial by jury, their protection against double jeopardy and unreasonable search and seizure, and their recognition of the right to bear arms, announced to the world our national values and ideals. They have served as the standards by which we measure our individual actions and the actions of our government toward its own citizens. Yet, hallowed by time as the Declaration and the Bill of Rights have become, it is crucial to place these two documents in their historical context and examine the immediate circumstances that generated them. The men who created the Declaration did so to justify a revolution, and the men who passed the Bill of Rights acted to secure the loyalty of citizens wary of their new federal government. The men who debated, revised, and campaigned for and against the first 10 amendments were 18th century Americans. Their world is not ours. The memories they carried were of imperial abuses, the painful renunciation of their English identities, and a long and exhausting war for independence. The excitement they felt and the fears that haunted them were the result of a rare opportunity to create a new nation and to establish it as a republic. If they knew they were making history, they did not know what that history would be. The men who produced the Bill of Rights were neither demigods nor visionaries. They were mere mortals, some brilliant, some quite ordinary, most of them wealthier and better educated than their neighbors. Almost all of them were veteran politicians, and though most of the issues they grappled with will seem foreign to us today, the tempo and tone of their politics will be familiar. In their wrangling and debating, in their manipulation of procedure to expedite their agenda or derail that of their opponents, in the flare-ups of ego and the indulgence of idiosyncrasy, and in the combustible mixture of self-interest, ideals, and principles that propelled them, these men resemble political leaders of every era. But in their burden of serving in a government without precedents and with uncertain legitimacy, in their pressing anxiety that this government might fail, and in their knowledge that America was dwarfed by the great imperial powers across the Atlantic, they are uniquely men of the late 18th century. In 1789, when James Madison proposed the Bill of Rights, the young nation faced a great ideological divide with regard to a question that is being revived today. Should broad power and authority reside in the federal government, as the Federalists wished, or should it reside in the state governments, where the antifederalists insisted it could best protect the people's liberties? In these early years of the new nation, this ideological struggle was raw and fraught with immediacy, for the Constitution that empowered the national government was new and lacked the traditions that, over time, lend legitimacy and elicit loyalty. The political decisions the men of this early era made forestalled but did not dissolve the tension between localism and nationalism that was endemic to the federal system they created. That tension would reemerge in the 19th century, when challenges to federal law and policy led to the Civil War. Even in our lifetime, this issue of where ultimate power should reside remains a Gordian knot. This confrontation between states' rights and national authority started with the fierce debates over ratification of the Constitution, and it continued in the first federal Congress, in the state legislatures, and in the press as Washington's first administration began. We can appreciate the Bill of Rights only in the context of this struggle. These amendments, conceived by James Madison, one of the most astute Federalists of his day, were intended to weaken, if not crush, the continuing opposition to the new federal government he had been so instrumental in creating. By assuring citizens that the new government would honor and protect their liberties, he hoped to achieve two interlocking goals. The first was to ease the fear of tyranny harbored by many within the general populace, and thus separate the antifederalist followers from their leaders. The second was to preempt the anti-federalists' plans to pass amendments that would severely restrict the powers of the new government. Madison's Bill of Rights was thus more a political strategy than a statement of America's most cherished values. Yet Madison was keenly aware of its potential to set a high standard for the relationship between citizens and the men who governed them. Even more important to Madison, this explicit guarantee of rights and liberties could play a critical role in protecting minority groups from abuse by the majority. The addition of these amendments was thus a patriotic as well as a political measure, for it was designed to strengthen Republican values and to ensure that the American government would honor the people's right to life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. It was the genius of James Madison that he could unite practical considerations and noble aspirations and join the ideological with the ideal. All of the rights Madison wished to protect had their roots in the founding generation's colonial and revolutionary past. They speak to imperial abuses and to hallowed Anglo-American traditions that do not resonate today. Yet the generations that followed added their understandings of these rights, just as today we add our own. In this way, the amendments once dismissed as only a parchment barrier remains our collective heritage, and we remain its guardian for future generations. 1. On September 12, 1787, Virginian George Mason rose on the floor of what came to be known as the Constitutional Convention. He proposed that the delegates gathered in Independence Hall add a Bill of Rights to the Constitution they had just created. The response Mason received was a resounding no. Was it possible that the men we call the Founding Fathers opposed such basic rights as freedom of speech, the press, or conscience? Was their intention to introduce a new tyranny, to replace the tyranny of George III and his government? Why was Mason's request so firmly denied? The answer is simple. These men were weary on that fateful September day. They had been meeting since mid-May, trudging through the rain on many a morning, or wiping the perspiration from their brows on those days when the stifling heat and humidity of an all-too-typical Philadelphia summer seemed unbearable. Their evenings had been spent in the cramped quarters above the city's many taverns, in rooms occupied by 2 and sometimes 3 men. Most surely slept fitfully, sharing beds in rooms redolent of spittoons and chamber pots, the smells intensified by the need to keep the shutters tightly closed against a summer invasion of blue-bottled flies. Far from home, counting house, law office, plantation, or farm, they fretted about inventories, clients, and crops, with no choice but to rely on the good sense of family members or employees to ensure that their fortunes did not suffer. As the weeks dragged by, they longed for the comforts of home, the satisfactions of a well-cooked meal, and the companionship of wives and children. Yet they stayed. They stayed because the business they had come to Philadelphia to do was too important to abandon. They were there, they believed, to save their country. They feared that their experiment in Republican government was in danger of invasion, or, worse, of internal collapse, if a new government was not created to replace the League of Friendship, known as the Confederation, which had proved woefully inadequate to deal with the problems facing America. The Articles of Confederation, America's first Constitution, did not owe its creation to a lapse of judgment on the part of the revolutionary generation. To the men who wrote it, this very restricted government seemed to perfectly embody the goals of their revolution. They did not yet think of themselves as citizens of a unified nation. Like their neighbors, they thought of themselves as Marylanders, Virginians, New Yorkers, or Connecticut men. Their history and their historical circumstances made this a reasonable identification. Their newly independent states had once been colonies, colonies with different patterns of settlement, different mixes of ethnic and religious populations, and different internal histories. Virginia did not share New York's Dutch origins. Connecticut's lingering Puritan heritage was alien to Pennsylvania's Quaker roots. And Maryland's religious wars between Catholics and Protestants had no parallel in Georgia or North Carolina. It was true that by the time the War for Independence began, all the rebellious colonies did have some striking political similarities. In each, the local legislature was elected by men whose race and property ownership qualified them to full citizenship. But families who traced their history back to Barbados refugees in South Carolina did not feel a natural affinity for the men and women who fled religious persecution to settle Massachusetts. Thus, it was not surprising that, when asked what his country was, a leading revolutionary like Patrick Henry could immediately respond, "Virginia is my country, sir." In short, the men who represented their rebellious states in the Continental Congress, and later in the Confederation Congress, were loyal not to something so vague as the United States, but to their own state. Travel and communication in the 18th century reinforced this loyalty to place that we today might dismiss as provincialism. The great revolutions in transportation and communication lay decades ahead in the 19th century. In 1776, when the Articles of Confederation were written, horses and horse-drawn carriages, often moving along little more than Indian paths, were the fastest modes of transportation. Travel from Boston to the Continental Congress in Philadelphia could take weeks if roads were washed out by rain or if rivers had risen too high for a man on horseback to ford. Indeed, to many a Georgian in the late 18th century, a trip to Massachusetts might as well have been a voyage to the moon. Ships, it was true, could sail along the coast of these mainland states, but few Georgia farmers were likely to be on board. Communication was unpredictable and cumbersome. Letters often found their way to their intended recipients through elaborate relays, entrusted first to friends heading to port cities, then passed on to ship captains heading in the right direction, and finally turned over to local residents who promised to deliver them to the addressee. Much depended on whether any link in this chain failed, and even when the system worked, it could take months for a letter to find its way from writer to reader. News traveled just as slowly in a world where not every household had access to a daily newspaper. Often the best source of news was travelers, especially ship captains, who brought with them newspapers already several months old. Under these circumstances, provincialism or localism was reasonable, even among men more privileged, better traveled, and more sophisticated than their neighbors. But ideology, as much as circumstances, played a critical role in the belief that a league of friendship among 13 separate and sovereign nation-states fulfilled the goals of the Revolution. The men who fought for independence had rallied to the cry, "No taxation without representation." And to them, this meant no taxation by any legislature other than their local assembly. The Lockean contract that a legitimate government must represent the interests and protect the liberties of those it governed had been reinterpreted by free Americans. It meant that only a government composed of men you knew, men who lived among you and shared your interests, deserved your obedience, your loyalty, and your taxes. As they began a war for independence against a distant government, made up of men who would not suffer the consequences of the taxes they imposed, Americans believed the only safeguard against such tyranny was to put power in the hands of local legislatures. Thus, the Continental Congress produced a constitution that preserved the sovereignty of the states and restricted the powers of the national government to the barest essentials, to coordinate the military and diplomatic war effort against Great Britain. Even this was miraculous, because the colonies had never before cooperated. But as they prepared to wage a war against the most powerful army and navy in the world, American leaders recognized the need for unity. The Constitution they drafted was, in many ways, a defense against a new tyranny. Their enemy had taxed them from afar and had regulated their trade and commerce. They would avoid creating another government with such powers. They would avoid suffering under a new tyrant by refusing to create a separate executive branch. They would deprive the government of the power to tax or dictate trade policy. They would not allow it to introduce a uniform currency that could prevent each state from providing its own citizens with ready cash. Above all, they would avoid attempts by large states to dominate small ones by ensuring a rule of one state, one vote in the new government. The Articles of Confederation embodied the hopes and fears of the revolutionaries. They were a culmination of the colony's 150 years of history as possessions of a powerful empire. But in the effort to avoid the oppressions of the past, the men who wrote this Constitution did not provide for the problems of the future. Those problems had emerged even before the ink on the peace treaty was dry in 1783. Peace brought a lingering post-war economic depression as America adjusted to its independence from Great Britain's protective, though often smothering, embrace. No longer escorted by Royal Navy vessels, American merchant ships carrying cargoes meant for Mediterranean buyers became easy targets for North African pirates. In New England, shippers discovered how much they had depended on trade with the Caribbean islands that flew the British flag. In Georgia and South Carolina, states that had suffered the devastation of two major British campaigns during the war, planters found themselves scrambling to find new slaves to replace those who had fled to the welcoming arms of the British Army. The new nation faced the embarrassment of debts to European allies that it could not pay. The government, forced to rely on requisitions from the states, found itself helpless to establish its credit, and efforts to borrow more money from Holland and France were futile. To the great embarrassment of the members of the Confederation Congress, the government was also unable to pay military veterans or repay the civilians who had sacrificed crops and livestock to the war effort. Confidence in the government's ability to honor the promissory notes called Continentals that it had given to farmers, merchants, and artisans could be measured by the popular term for worthlessness, not worth a continental. 4 years after the war ended, the new nation's borders stood virtually undefended against Indians or European powers. Britain still occupied its forts in the Ohio Valley, and alliances forming among displaced or threatened Indian tribes boded ill for eager American settlers. Perhaps most troubling of all was that the spirit of cooperation, which had reigned among the states during the struggle for independence, had evaporated. 13 separate nation-states now vied with one another for advantages in commerce and trade. Each established trade barriers at its borders, and thus duties had to be paid at every state line. Price gouging by New York, whose port city brought in vital foreign goods, enriched New Yorkers and enraged consumers in New Jersey and Connecticut. To the south, Virginia shamelessly exploited the consumer needs of North Carolina. Every state had its own currency, and some of this was worthless paper. Small wonder that interstate trade was in chaos, making recovery from post-war depression even more difficult. By the time the Philadelphia Convention met, the members of the Confederation Congress, sitting in New York City, had thrown up their hands and surrendered any hope of solving these pressing problems. Surveying the situation, the former commander-in-chief of the Continental Army, George Washington, lamented that the Confederation was a mere shadow of a government. And William Pierce of Georgia described the Confederation as a ship bearing under the weight of a tempest. It is trembling and just on the point of sinking. The men who met in Philadelphia agreed with these sentiments. Clearly something had to be done to save their country. And this was why, by September 1787, The delegates to the convention had put themselves through over 4 grueling months of debate, discussion, and often heated argument. This is why they endured cramped quarters, dismal weather, and a steady diet of tavern food. Behind locked doors and draped windows, they had undertaken the task of writing a new constitution. If any group was up to the challenge, these 54 delegates were. Gathered in Independence Hall were members of America's economic and social elite, men far better educated and more widely traveled than their farmer and shopkeeper neighbors. And in a society that still assumed men of wealth should hold the reins of government, their political leadership experience was broad and deep. They had learned politics at the dinner table, listening to fathers, uncles, cousins, and older brothers. They had studied rhetoric and political philosophy at colleges at home and abroad, and most of them were trained in the law. They had served in continental congresses, colonial assemblies, and state legislatures. They had overseen trials as justices of the peace and directed state policies as governors. During the Revolution, many had led men into battle as Continental Army officers, and thus they had observed firsthand how that experience had unified men of every region and state. Many, though not all of them, had been born or educated abroad, and this background, like their army experience, had given them a less provincial perspective than most of their fellow members of the American elite. They were, in Alexander Hamilton's apt phrase, men who thought continentally, men who wanted to create a nation, not a loosely knit confederation of squabbling states. The charge they had been given by the Confederation Congress was narrow: propose amendments to strengthen the current Constitution. But men like Virginia's James Madison, New York's Alexander Hamilton, Pennsylvania's Benjamin Franklin, and the universally admired George Washington believed the crisis was too serious for mere patchwork. Thus, within the first week of the convention, the delegates had agreed to abandon what they saw as a faulty government and create a new one. The men who made this decision to abandon one frame of government and create another understood the challenge they faced, and they were uncertain if they were wise enough to meet it. But they knew they had models to guide them. Behind them were 2 centuries of Anglo-American political culture, with its emphasis on the rule of law, its limitations on the power of the men in office, and its threefold division of government into executive, legislative, and judicial branches. Their republic would have no king, and no legislative branch belonging to the aristocracy, of course. This was one legacy of the Revolution. But whatever form the new framework took, it would draw its authority from the consent of the governed. Many of the delegates had participated in the arduous process of drafting and seeing ratified their state constitutions. But they knew that the superimposition of what 18th-century men called an energetic national government on 13 quarrelsome mini-nations, each jealously guarding its sovereignty, would be far more controversial. This is why anxiety, thick as the summer humidity, hung over the convention throughout its months of deliberation. The delegates knew that the government they designed must have far more power than the one they sought to replace. The question was, how much power? Ardent nationalists like Madison, Hamilton, and Pennsylvania's brilliant, flamboyant Governor Morris wanted to provide a full panoply of powers: the right to tax, to regulate foreign and interstate trade, to raise an army for defense, and to establish a uniform currency. Above all, they wished to create a truly national government able to win the loyalty of citizens of every state. But this was far from a goal shared outside the convention walls. Many of the political leaders who refused to attend this convention did not wish to see such a transfer of loyalty. Devoted revolutionaries like Samuel Adams of Massachusetts and Patrick Henry of Virginia continued to believe that representative government meant local government. When Henry learned of the gathering in Philadelphia, his judgment was succinct. "I smell a rat," he declared, for he was certain the delegates intended to abandon the Articles and propose a new government. Men like Henry were immune to Hamilton's plea that Americans think continentally. They embraced the political certainty that only a local government could understand and serve the interests of the citizens. Even within the convention, Madison and Hamilton knew, there were delegates wary of creating a government that would erode the autonomy of the states. The divided loyalties of the former governor of Virginia, 34-year-old Edmund Randolph, the cranky but clever Elbridge Gerry of Massachusetts, and many of the men from smaller states, would be revealed in the daily efforts to thread the needle between the preservation of state authority and the empowering of a central government. Compromise was the watchword of the convention's deliberation, but perseverance proved the mode. Debates and arguments over the structure and shape of the new national government were long and often redundant. Over the months, the convention repeatedly circled back to revive issues once deemed resolved. No vote ever seemed final, no decision above reconsideration. What could not be resolved was sent to committees, where debate continued, but the pressure to compromise was greater. Although the convention adjourned each day around 4 p.m., discussion often continued long into the night. Caucuses of like-minded state delegations met to plan the next day's strategy, while anxious men gathered to tally and retally potential votes. On the best of evenings, essential compromises were hammered out over a glass or two of good port wine. By July, the general shape of the new government and the scope of its powers had been decided. While these powers would seem broad to many opponents of the Constitution, they may seem curiously limited to modern sensibilities. To the founders, the national government's raison d'etre was threefold: the defense of the country's borders, the maintenance of law and order at home, and the establishment of a stable and expanding economy based on good credit. These powers were, in effect, to be siphoned away from the states in an arrangement that was truly novel for the 18th century world. It was called federalism. Under this system of shared sovereignty, the national government acquired some exclusive powers, the states retained exclusive rights to others, and some belonged to both. Under federalism, the convention left untouched and unchallenged many of the powers enjoyed by the state governments. States would determine voting requirements, they would determine the fate of slavery within their borders, they retained taxing powers, and they maintained their own judicial systems. The delegates were practical politicians, not idealists, and they understood the limit of their capacity to wrest power from the states where it resided. Some delegates believed the states would reject federalism. A few delegates would, in the end, refuse to sign a document they felt robbed the states of too much autonomy. On the other hand, the devout nationalist Alexander Hamilton felt that federalism left the task of nation-building incomplete. His solution struck most of the delegates as even more extreme and surely less realistic. Hamilton proposed to abolish the states. Weeks and months of argument, debate, and compromise took their toll. Patience had grown short as August turned to September, and nerves were frazzled. By September 12th, the delegates believed that all that stood between them and home were a few small finishing touches to their new Constitution. And then George Mason demanded a statement of the rights and liberties of the people. Mason's proposal on that fateful September day took the majority of delegates by surprise. Only the men of the Committee on Detail, charged with polishing the language of the Constitution, might have seen it coming, for South Carolina's brash young delegate, Charles Pinckney, had pressed them in late August to add a guarantee of several rights to the document. The committee had rejected the idea. Now Mason had revived it, calling on the whole convention to produce a national Bill of Rights. No one doubted Mason's sincerity, for his reputation as a champion of rights was well known at the convention. A scion of a wealthy planter family, the 62-year-old Mason had authored his own state's Declaration of Rights, making Virginia the first state to guarantee freedom of the press, tolerance of religion, protection from unreasonable searches, and the right to a fair and speedy trial. What the delegates did doubt, however, was Mason's sanguine assurances that the drafting of a Bill of Rights could be done quickly. They knew from experience that nothing at the convention was speedily done. A nightmare vision arose of days of wrangling and debate. What rights would they agree to include? How could they be certain these were the most deserving of protection? If a critical right was overlooked, would that mean it would...
Sample complete. Ready to continue?